attend our activities will notice that this is a different topic. Usually we go on about mostly political issues. Our last talk was about Islamists in power, and we had a young scholar and Saadin Ibrahim discussing the impact of Islamists in both Tunisia and Egypt. We have a different topic today. And I thought that we need to raise the issue, the relationship between art and society. This is not the first time. We did it almost 3 years ago when we had a Saudi novelist coming to talk about the relationship between literature and gender in Saudi Arabia. And that was in Tahrir Square. But this is the first time really we deal with art and society in the new campus. And as our speaker reminded me, it was somehow my choice to bring in Youssef Chahine. So I assume the responsibility. I have to say I had a bias in favor of Youssef Chahine. I thought that he was one of the greatest cinema directors and also actors. We tend to know him only as a director, but I remember when I was a little kid and I saw his film Bab al-Hadid, Railway Station, where he was simply a star and raising lots of issues about the underdeveloped and acting so well. I thought that he would continue, but he chose to focus on film direction. The last 2 hours we have seen one of his great films, and that was our speaker's choice, La Sparrow, and those who attended actually brought, it is a film that brought back a crucial part of history. Sad history in Egypt, but I think it was very well done and revealed precisely the relationship between art and society. So this is about Youssef Chahine. And I did the shift not only because of Youssef Chahine, but because of having a speaker who would have the knowledge and the interest to talk about Youssef Chahine. And I come to today's speaker, Marwa Maziad. And actually, I don't know, I was telling her, I don't know how to introduce her. Her CV is 21 pages. And I wouldn't take all the time to talk about her achievements, but essentially she is in the fields of art, mass comm, journalism, and she's finishing her PhD in political science at the University of Washington in Seattle. So she goes from writing newspapers articles, dealing with art, and also writing academic papers about a topic that is very timely: civil-military relations, a comparison between Turkey and Egypt. She's not going to talk about that today, but she's going to talk about Youssef Chahine and linking Youssef Chahine not only to the past, but to the present. And especially, not only about Egypt, but what she calls the cultural dialogue. Youssef Chahine was a cosmopolitan. And what impressed me about him, not only his knowledge of 5 languages, he was born in Alexandria, and then helped people to be cosmopolitan at the time. But also, when he was asked if you were Christian or Muslim, he always answered, I'm an Egyptian. And that was the answer that he insisted on, whether in Egypt or in France or in Italy. He's a great person, as an Egyptian, as an artist. And I think Marwa Maziad will bring all of that out.
Thank you for being here. It means a lot to me to be back to AUC because I'm an alumna and I left a long time ago. And going in preparation for this talk, I had to get to one of the themes that I will be sharing, which is the idea that the research trajectory that you take is always anchored in something very personal and something very inceptive, like very, very old story somehow. So the topic of Youssef Chahine was my master's thesis, and that was a long time ago at University of Washington in the Department of Communication. But reflecting on how I even chose him as a topic of research, I had to go back to high school at the time. And I don't know, some of you, I went to a French-English school, and I had the regular curriculum, the French curriculum with the regular education system. And there was a book, it was called En Français aussi, and there was an interview in this book with Youssef Chahine. And I remember very well that I usually don't prepare my lessons before school. I'm just a good student who goes and listens, but I'm not prepared before. And that was the first lesson I even bothered to prepare before. I was very excited that we're going to cover him. So how did I even know about him? It's probably because at the time I was watching a lot of TV and Bernamik Zoom and Salma Shamma and all these film and cinema programs that at the time when you were only watching one or two channels. So you're not watching all these kind of satellite dishes and all these channels. So there was, you had a collective a memory of somehow, of some sort. So I go to the lesson and I remember very well two things out of this interview. The first thing that he was talking about was how much he described his cosmopolitan Alexandria family, hybrid Greek and Lebanese and background of his, and the idea that he jumped from one language to the other. He said that they mixed, on a sauté d'une langue à l'autre, on a mélangé tout. So he spoke English, French, because he went to Victoria College, which is an English school, so he's Anglophone and he's introduced to Hamlet and the British literature. And then he is French speaking as well, and then he's Greek. And so this idea of jumping from one language to the other was the first thing I noticed in the interview, and I decided I'll also learn a whole lot of languages. And I'm proud to say that I speak 8 of them by now. So it was this encounter with this person who's saying he's doing something, and then it inspires you to do something similar. The second thing in the interview was his relationship to the Sea of Alexandria. And I remember in that interview he was saying that he always imagined who's the other on the other shore. So he's thinking who's sitting on the other side when he's sitting. And there's a quote that says, perhaps imagination is intelligence having fun. And I think he's a very intelligent person who was having fun with imagining who's that other on the other side might be. So mind you, I'm a high school student at the time, and I still remember these two things. So as I was even putting my application together to go to school, I decided I wanted to go to AUC because I can be more interdisciplinary in it, I can learn a few things. And then it became just a window on the outside world. So I go to do my master's and I'm doing my PhD and I'm finishing that up, and I was faculty member in Qatar and Turkey, and so all over the place. I think it was this idea of a man who was communicating with the other on the other side of that lake called the Mediterranean. So just to give you how much the research agenda that you develop and your life trajectory could be really anchored in a very small anecdote or story you were inspired by. When I was doing my master's in communication at the time, I wanted to study intercultural communication. And then it came the idea that I wanted to do cinema as a medium of intercultural communication. So Youssef Chahine became kind of like, let me trace him back. And like a good student at the time, I was in Seattle and I called his office to do a screening of his film Destiny. And I thank all the people in the Masr al-Alamiya production company, because I called him from Seattle. I said, I want to send me some posters and let's introduce him to the American academic, something like that, you know, to have an event. And I thank Ahmed al-Bahad, who was my first contact. So it was going to be a small event, but then you keep building up, and then I suggested him as a person who initiated a communication, a dialogue between East and West. So my thesis became titled eventually Youssef Chahine Cinema, the hospitable space between self and other. And I discovered by analyzing 9 of his films at the time that Youssef Chahine did something quite different from being the national artist who's so insular in his story about his national self in Egypt, but that it had a feature that is very communicative to the outside world. So in order to kind of theoretically help myself with that, how to kind of address, how to understand him, I looked at Edward Said's conceptualization of Orientalism and East-West relations. I looked at Stuart Hall's conceptualization at the time and the question of cultural identity in a global context. And I looked at Frantz Fanon and his idea of the colonized colonizer. And the 3 of them seemed to me to offer kind of a triad of some sort. Edward Said, of course, for those of you who are familiar with his work, Orientalism, was a book about the magnitude of the knowledge produced by the West about the Orient, the East. And his first intervention in that was to say, there is a huge body of work about how that East was portrayed. So this is one, I need to trace back how that image was constructed. His second point in writing this book, Orientalism, was to kind of pay attention or draw the attention of the so-called Oriental, the third world citizen, that other, not to internalize this image of himself or herself as an othered subject. He wanted to intervene with the idea of internalized Orientalism, internalized inferiority, if you will, or just this kind of unbalanced relationship between East and West. The third purpose when he wrote this book was to actually argue that there is a third place for this relationship, where it's more conducive to a dialogue and a place of conversation, not kind of a reverse Orientalism in the sense of Occidentalism, or like the hate sent back, or the unbalanced relation redirected or something like that. So these kind of 3 anchors were what I concluded from Orientalism, Edward Said's book. Then Stuart Hall, mind you, these were, I was writing that mid-2000s, right after September 11, and right around the war on Iraq. So 2003, 2004. And I met Youssef Chahine, I had 2 interviews with him, and I interned with him, and I shot the making of his film. I met Edward Said at the time. I mean, I was really concerned with this intercultural dialogue at the time. So Stuart Hall's book, article, Cultural Identity in a Global Context, was written in '96. If you think about that, it's like 20 years ago. But it's still very relevant to what we're saying, because Stuart Hall was talking about how would we constitute identities in this moment of global change, mind you, 96. And he also concluded that there are either a direction or a tendency to go towards being a translated person, and a translated person is a person who carries himself or herself and translate themselves into the other culture and take from it and they translate themselves back and forth. The other alternative is to have this kind of closure. You become closed on yourself, you essentialize yourself, you go to a nationalist kind of Puritan version of who you are, either nationalistically or religiously. And that kind of, it happened back in the day. They were saying that would create a lot of polarization in the world, and that would be conducive to a lot of antagonism, something Edward Said was not advocating at all. So the third alternative for Stuart Hall was this idea of a hybrid identity that can navigate back and forth and go back and forth and explore, and has no attachment, kind of a stifling attachment to either or. So here, another triad for me. Frantz Fanon, who wrote about colonizer relationships also, was talking about how the post-colonial subject deals with identity and articulating his identity. And he talks about also a phase one of complete assimilation into the culture. So you want to be more American than the American, you want to be more British than the British, you want to be more French than the French, and it's total assimilation. The second phase is one of remembrance, and it becomes more of nostalgia and going back to the roots and becoming in search of some authentic truth about who you are. But the third phase is a combative phase, where you're actually, again, not locked into an assimilation or locked into an essentialist, nationalist, Puritan version of who you are within your roots. And you combat everybody and you fight for freedom everywhere. So these kind of were conceptually the things I was dealing with when I was examining Youssef Chahine's cinema. And I concluded that he was someone who really inhabited this combative phase for most of his life. He was going to fight at all times for a particular value, and that is freedom of thinking and freedom of expression and freedom of free thought, whether here, there, anywhere. Actually, it's ironic that this is the Caravan back in 2000, and I was the photo editor at the time, so he came and gave us a talk. And again, reading this interview today, it seems like as if he's really with us, because he's talking about leadership needs free expression and how freedom of expression is the origin of all rights, because without it you cannot actually seek any other right. If you don't have the voice to speak up, then what else do you have? And I was the photographer for that, so I was very happy to find this in my boxes here in Egypt. So as you can see, that he was someone who fought this fight of a combatant in his cinema. So how did he do that? For my work, I started by Bab al-Hadid and went through that phase. His fight was actually from just genre, and in film studies you have approaches to film criticism. Either you put the cinema as genre, okay, so melodrama, comedy, action, and that's kind of the typical Hollywood approach to how you categorize films. Or you go into this idea of the auteur theory, like the idea that the filmmaker is an author. He writes a piece of art, which is the film, and he is responsible for this vision. another approach to analyzing his films is social sciences, where you locate his cinema as not just one freedom of expression as I'm expressing myself, it's located within a conversation of actual political and social realities and concerns. And that's why the art and society, politics triad is not that disconnected also in the cinema. It's not that there is a realm of art for him and a realm of politics for him. I concluded that the personal is the political. And he narrates stories that are very personal, but they are reflective of a circumstance. So when I asked him, how does he come up, what's his source of inspiration? How does he come up with the idea? He said, you mean, what am I fighting for? And he said that there's always a premise. And that premise for him is a point of attack. He's going to talk about that topic. And then he has to give himself a year or two to think and write and edit and rethink. So he's very meticulous about the idea that film is not a packageable thing. It's not a product. It's not the factory in the Hollywood sense of industry. He's actually, so Bab al-Hadid for him was almost a fight against genre and against the studio. And again, in cinema studies, the auteur theory, or like this idea that the author has to think of what his cinema of ideas is all about, came from a fight back in Hollywood itself. We know Chahine, who was an assistant director in America in the 40s and the 50s. And at some point, he's known as the martyr of the Hollywood system, because he had long footage, he wanted to have complete authorship over what to edit and how to produce his films, and he was out of the system. Nobody was going to give him the platform within this system. So auteur theory itself in France, that was born in the 50s, was a response of rescuing the author in the Hollywood system. So his first fight would be in Bab al-Hadid, because at the time, I don't know if you know the circumstances of this film, nobody watched it. It was, even Hindustan didn't have a gig like a year, or Farid Shawi. I mean, they were at home for 2 years because people were like, what is this? It's so neorealistic. It has a character of a crippled man who's observing things around him. It narrates social class relations. It was neo-realism of the Italian style, and that was too much for the box office at the time. And mind you, Egypt, of course, has a very strong industrial cinema industry, so he's intervening with that. So that's his first intervention. Later, he becomes interested in the political, historical narrative. So he produces Salah ad-Din, and that's kind of the glorification. Al-Nasr Salah ad-Din, there is even a story of how Al-Nasr was added at the time as a title to this, because it was about glory and also in an intercultural narrative narrated there between Richard and Salah ad-Din, and what are the notions of the land and what are the notions of the Crusaders coming. I mean, I'm not going to focus on this film in particular, but historically his intervention with this was to raise a sense of Arab consciousness and Arab identity at the time. But then that contrasts very much with the film I am really paused at right now, when we have The Choice later, and then you have by 1972 The Sparrow, which we just screened. How many of you have seen this film? I was 4. The Sparrow. Yeah, I recommend you watching this film in relationship to the contemporary moment. This film was very unique in its timing. It was produced 1972. So there was no battle of 6 October, and there is no victory, and there is no, yet anyway. He wrote and produced at 71, 72. And in this film, since now my topic is on civil-military relations, that's my actual research, I'm very drawn to reread that, because to go revisit this film, because here is Youssef Chahine answering to us anything he would have wanted to say had he been alive, which is the title of this talk. What would Youssef Chahine say today? And in this film, he shows that the ultimate defeat on June 5th was an internal matter. It was the product of corruption, of disformed state-society relations, of rhetoric, and there is a line there where they're saying, we talk revolution, we write revolution, but we don't revolt. And just the synopsis of the film goes about a corruption case within Egypt in early June 1967, so prior to June 5th. And the whole idea is that there is a journalist who wants to trace what's the corruption about these factories are. So they are public factories that are being built for 6 years, so they are under construction for 6 years, so they are never built. And what happens is that machines are put in these factories so that actually a private company comes and takes these machines, and it's kind of a corruption case that the public sector is a facade of a lot of actual corruption. Nothing gets built, but the public sector promises that it's state capitalism is managing everything, but then there are all these vignettes of corruption. And the journalist wants to investigate that in Upper Egypt. But the circumstance of how this primary story of an internal matter in Egypt should be at the forefront of what Egyptians are concerned with. You see on the periphery of that how his editor-in-chief kind of says, we're in a state of aggression now, forget about that, that's not the story. And he insists that the internal story is all about the preparation of Lagro for an external story. The film was censored, and the script, that's why it seems a little bit convoluted and very hard to access at times, but the characters were clear. You had a sheikh he doesn't necessarily represent an Islamist, but he is educated in Al-Azhar, and we refer to him all throughout as the sheikh. You have the journalist who's a liberal who wants to uncover this corruption case. You have what he calls the lawful thieves, so these are the higher-ups, including that we discovered that very higher-up is his own father, but it doesn't matter because he's finding out he's on his own cause. And then we see the police officer who's trying to also do his job, and these characters that are very complex are representative of what he wanted to say, that Egyptian society as a very complex self here is what should be examined. Not the other on the other side, not the war we're in as Israel on the frontier. Whatever is happening in society, state-society relations within are at the crux of whatever will happen at the outside. Now that would have been a very difficult message to say 70, 71, 72. And that's why I say, and I argued in my work, that Youssef Chahine spoke always so soon, much sooner than others. That's why sometimes he was not understood. And again, when I asked him, I asked him about that, he was very agitated. And he said, oh, what you need to do is to watch my film again, pay another ticket or something, and go sit with it again. Because this idea of you're not accessible, you're not communicative, you're not understood, was a struggle he had as he's trying to express something that he can foresee. I mean, can you really imagine someone who sees things before others? It's almost as if he's blind, because when you see things before others and want to talk about them and nobody's even registering, that's a struggle in of itself. And then you might just like lose hope and not do it, but he was always combating that to make it feel at a time, put a tiny stamp on it, and let it live and go on. That's why it lives with us. In the trilogy, after this episode of the 70s, in the 80s, he started doing his autobiography. And again, his autobiography, Alexandria Why, Egyptian Story, and Alexandria Again and Forever, in terms of periodization and theorization of these 80s moments, in film, I argue also, I think I have this notion that in time of lack of political participation and lack of political openness, filmmakers tend to go back to themselves and tell very personal and insular stories. And these films actually live. When I compare that to the Turkish cinema as well, in the 80s, right after a military intervention in 1980 that was very expansive, all the 80s, in interviewing some of the filmmakers there, they were talking about how the filmmaker at this kind of closure of a political space goes back to himself and writes his own personal film. But that film is always loaded with a lot of social and political messages. And I think for those of you who haven't watched The Sparrow and Asfour, you should really watch it and read how in 71, 72, this filmmaker is telling a very personal story, but it's juxtaposed against a circumstance of potential war and state-society relations. So the political is really there, but it's told through a very personal, very well-rounded characters in this film. So when you go through this trilogy, Alexandria Why, and he revisits his own Alexandria at the time of trying to get to East-West relations, late 70s into the 80s, that person of becoming the political is not an abandoning of his combative interventionist cinema. In fact, it's a vehicle for doing that. He then moves to a little bit of commercialization, I argue, with the movie Destiny and the movie The Other, Al-Akhar, and then there's Alexandria Noor, and also a film that he contributed to September 11 as an omnibus, kind of a collection of film. And this is his merger with the idea that if I'm not reaching a lot of people, then maybe I'm not communicating enough. And you do see some commercialization of his films at the time, but then the message is still original. In 1999, I did with the film Al-Akhar, which I really don't like. I think it's soap opera-ish, you know, very much so, very clear-cut characters. America is the mother, and then there is the son, and it's very kind of straightforward, not your regular Youssef Chahine type. But at the time, nobody even knew the term globalization. He talked about globalization in 1999 when that term was not in the newspapers. When I interviewed him, I said again, where do you find your inspiration? He said, so there is a premise, there is a fight, and then I have to give it time, and I have to write and rewrite. But then I have to read a lot of very specialized, up-to-date, almost academic journals, Jacob Report, and to know what's going on at the global level. So he educates himself politically, and then he thinks, then he goes to visit his drama. He has to go revise his Shakespeare and tragedy, Greek tragedy, and all of that, and then he starts creating characters. So I think in this entire particular film, if you watched it, the characters were a little bit too cliche or caricature, but again, as I say, he puts a stamp on his thought, produces a film in 1999 talking about international globalization, and when nobody was really talking about that in the newspaper at the time. And there is an uncanny scene there in 99 where he's talking about jihadists and the beginning of armed Islamists and all that of the 90s, not the 80s of Afghanistan, so the reminiscence of that. But there is a scene there, if you watch the film again, there's a big building with with a tower, with one tower, and what do I want to say? A shell kind of form thing, not like actually not a rocket going into it. I mean, watching that in retrospect, mind you, in the film it was about a military target. It was actually a shot of a kind of a military target, so a rocket going into a building. But the idea of having kind of the visual prophecy almost of some of these things and seeing it sooner than others and depicting it was almost kind of like you need to sketch it because you need to say something, get it out there. I felt in his later years he became more urgent, kind of wanted to say things and say them as soon as possible, and then dealing with them with the critique later. By the time, and I think this has to do with the pairing with Khalid Youssef, which has his own kind of straightforward political kind of message in his films, was very different from Youssef Chahine's history. Some critique that. I think as far as Youssef Chahine was concerned, he wanted to collaborate with people who would give him ideas. He collaborated with Naguib Mahfouz, with Lutfi al-Kholi, because he always thought that he needs to write with someone who gives him this kind of political, dense ideology, but then he has to translate it cinematically. And of course, for the aesthetics of Youssef Chahine, that's a talk on of itself. I mean, the image of Youssef Chahine, how he animates his screen, people can come from here, move into that, and it's a still shot, it's almost theatrical, but then it's still photography, but then it's still, I mean, the compositions and all that. He's a visual architect, and that's his sense and skill, and to merge these two together is not always success. It's not always 100% successful, but his intentions, even around Destiny, which was all about talking about Andalusian Ibn Rushd and the time where Arabs and other religions and sects and all that were living together, is almost going back to his Alexandria. So he's always bringing conversation that can be hospitable to the self and to the other, regardless of who's defined as the self and who's the other. Within the Egyptian society, he has many selves, so he's going to see conflicting voices, but they are hospitable and they are welcome in his cinema. They are not excluded. And in his establishing this relationship between East and West, he's always conversant with the West. It's never, it's always what Edward Said was arguing for. You don't want to just create a caricatured Occidentalist kind of rebuke or rebuttal. So those who knew him were all thinking, what would he say around September, around January 25th, 2011. He passed away in 2008. But I can see scenes, like, as I said, the quote of revolution in 1972. He was talking about a revolution on state-society relations. He was talking about a freedom of expression and knowing the truth and never be lied about the facts and the preparation of the army for the actual battle. He was talking about issues of the public sector and the economy, and how is that creating corruption in collaboration with the private sector at the time. Actually, if you really think about it, if that's made in 1972, we always attribute to Sadat and Infitah and corruption cases of the time and all of that, as if that only happened in the 70s, this private-public disturbed relationship. Well, it seems like that was in the early 70s as well, and the late 60s. So we have to even revisit history, since he had said it that soon. So we shouldn't just think that this complicated relation of public and private capital was only during the 70s, for instance. It goes back to this idea of the state is running things, but actually is giving it to the cronies, and all of that goes back to even the late Nasser period. So periodization and revisiting our own history merits some attention. I might just have one scene that I wanted to share with you to illustrate that. So it's a 2-minute scene from
فاهم؟ وبلاش زرع. ما دام كل واحد بيفكر في نفسه وكل واحد من بتوعه، يبقى انا كمان لازم اشوف شغلي، وشغلي ناخد بطارق محمدين. فين ابو خطبي يا يوسف؟ انت الوحيد اللي شفته.
الثانية كانت أموال وجه بسبب نقل المصنع وحملوه على الكليات. فقال وأنا سبت.
هو ابو خطبي اللي دخلك عشان تدافع عنه؟
أنا ما بدافعش عنه. أنا عايز أتمسك هو حي بيرجع مش جوزك نفسك.
وكمان خايف عليك، خايف على وجه السفاح.
افهم. أنا اللي يهمني اللي ورا السفاح. الأصول الشرعيين الكبار سفاحين على أمينات حواليه.
برافو. وصلت يا استاذ يوسف. أسكتك إنه الناس اللي بتاعك وقت من الأسنين.
خلي بالك يا سفاح. قول لي يا عم شريف، لبنانيين عمالين يقتلوا بعض. لا ده واحد، ده واحد من الطب، في واحد ضد بتوع غيره. اللي هو اسماعيل بنفسه.
Maybe I will actually open it a little bit for a discussion.
Excellent. Excellent. You have a speaker who talked with passion, and I think she raised lots of basic issues, and we see how an artist actually, who was born in 1926, can talk about events of today, linking that to Edward Said and Franz Fanon. All of them actually have passed away. But like great minds, they are with us in their ideas. I think we will open then the topic for discussion. I'm sure that you have lots of comments, questions.
Well, it was always. Thank you. It was always quite amusing for me to see that the movies of Youssef Chahine were actually translated into French and English. Like you can't see that nowadays in the Arabic movies. So it seems that while he was directing the movie and producing it, he meant another audience, not only to the Egyptian theater, which is quite interesting for me.
This is often taken as a critique. Are you bringing it as a criticism or rather as a universal conversation, and he has always the international viewer in mind? Because as I say, everything, he was almost always critiqued for having this international broad audience, for not being nationalist enough or insular enough. But if you're still puzzled why I brought Edward Said and Franz Fanon, is exactly to help us see what you need to produce in terms of intellect or art that is not just insular within your nationalist self. You need to translate and transgress even that very insular self. And that was his fight all of it together. And actually this is the fight today, where you're thinking, if you're not Egyptian enough, if you're not patriotic enough, if you're not nationalistic enough. So he was struggling with these things. Internationalism sometimes backfires. But to be along these great thinkers who thought about East-West relations, like, as I said, Said and Fanon and Stuart Hall, you need to be your independent, universal person, not just a person who's stifled by your own identity. So it's a very poetic and it's a struggle to have an identity that is not just assimilated without any criticism of that universal other, but also not to be prisoned in your own identity. So he definitely speaks to a large audience, and probably because he is very conversant with this idea, I'm going to read Hamlet, and I'm going to do Shakespeare, and I'm going to do the Greek tragedy, and I'm going to produce Inawi of Bab al-Hadid. So his product is a very Egyptian character. All these are very Egyptian characters, but they are the synthesis of universal human history, I think.
Most of his film is based on like theatrical, the setup of the cinema. So the setup of the cinema was film. Does it mostly come from theatre?
No,
as opposed to pure cinema?
He studied at Pasadena Playhouse, and he studied theater and cinema, of course. No, he has a very cinematic language in the sense of the screen and the camera. But I think at some points, like this even scene, it was set theatrically, where someone moves, and I don't see that very much. But again, it's an animation of a setup where a character will pop and go, but actually in a very village-like house like that, the stairs are in the middle, so the movement is not imposed, but it makes you think about the aesthetics of the theater as well. What do you think? What do you think?
You spoke about that last scene. That's what gave me the idea. Yeah. The last scene is very theatrical, but also realistic cinematically. If you want to talk about, they are in a village. That's what the village actually looks like. So yeah.
Yeah. So his styles have always been even very much of a synthesis of everything that he learned or experienced. He has a Fellini-esque kind of film in his Alexander Again and Forever. He has a very neorealism in Bab al-Hadid. He has some of this is a beautifully shot film if you watch it. Not this copy perhaps, but sometimes he uses still images, and the camera is just like still, and maybe just one person is walking on the street, and that's the only movement you have. I mean, we can go on about that.
Was his pioneerism a little bit too much at the time? Maybe being a pioneer coming from getting educated. Where did he get educated? In the States?
In California.
I mean, he was brought up in Egypt, so he knows the people. Maybe his sort of pioneerism was too quick. Maybe he should have taken his time a bit. I mean, I want to really win. I want to give you my ideas. But how about if I do it over 10, 15 years, not straight away? Was his way a little bit too crass? Was it too quick?
Yeah.
I mean, it took us years to understand what he wanted to say, yeah? Or did we get it straight away?
Yes, I think this idea of speaking too soon and you risk being not understood is something he struggled with all his life, because he's part of an international conversation just by virtue of how he's exposed to Godin and other filmmakers and the new wave. I mean, he is, and then he brings that in a very quintessentially Egyptian story. And this kind of clash of all these identities within make his work stand out for what it is. And I think that's why it merits a study of like actually an object of study, or really approaching it. So some of what you described is actually correct.
Thank you very much. It was a very nice talk. Thank you.
Could you educate practically from the very beginning of having any contact with Egypt? I heard about Youssef Chahine, but then I was in Paris, etc. So could you educate me, what is the take or the reception of the general mass of people about Youssef Chahine? Is he respected, admired from the general public, or is it more the intellectuals who appreciate him? Were his films good box office? Did they sell? I mean, you said in the beginning not, but did it eventually have good box office? Could you situate it a little bit?
Yes, I think he's all of that, and to answer your question, so you know that you always hear about him in the West, and he's all in all third world, third cinema, kind of the filmmakers who make films outside of the Hollywood system, right? So the idea that you always hear about him in the West is because he also was active in the production. He co-produced with France. And his production company, he realized after Bab al-Hadid that the first film that was not a box office, that he has to produce his own films as well to make them happen. And in his interviews with me, he was really struggling with the US distribution because he was talking about why his films are not really showing in cinemas and maybe in small universities here and there, but not in the movie theaters, just in festival and all that. And I think towards the end, he wanted his films to be seen and watched internationally because he's very cognizant of the effect of American foreign policy and America in the region. So he was arguing that if they see our films, if they know who we are, if they watch us, then we will be people for them. We're not just objects on a map or a geography they are not familiar with to begin with. So he was very concerned of presenting Egypt to the outside world. But as someone who communicates between cultures all the time, he risks being misunderstood by both. So for an American audience, it's like he's still other, and who are you and where are you and why do we care? But for an Egyptian audience, it's too internationalist as well. Who are you catering for? Why are you talking? Why are you speaking in a language that we might not understand? So for the longest time, he struggled with that. And his solution became when he started collaborating with Khalid Youssef, his co-assistant, and it was all about bringing his films to box offices. And because he simplified a little bit his storylines, and it became really destiny that Al-Qasir really sold in the movie theaters in 1998. So if he started working back in 48 really, by 98 he was also a box office.
What about Al-Asfour?
Al-Asfour at the time, no, Al-Asfour, that was really a very special production. He co-produced it with Algeria. It was censored, it did not air right away, it was not, so he struggled with it, but he wanted to make it. That's the kind of artist he is. That document is here for us to examine years later. And perhaps the reason why I picked this scene, it's the idea of the conversation between the journalist who's a liberal, who's a progressive, and then the Islamist / Sheikh Islam kind of representative in this. And this conversation at the time, the portrayal of a very diverse society at the time, I think was very important. But there are so many references in this dialogue that resonate with me today. This idea of like, where am I? I'm on the periphery of everything that the Sheikh speaks. I think is very telling to a lot of what we're engaging with right now.
So what would you hope for the future? So the way he sort of organised his films and made his films, what would you hope for the future for Egyptian filmmakers? What was his message? Make what we feel. Let's have a message. Let's have a risala, or let's sell cinema.
No, he always thought, by the way, that the film has to be entertaining. So as he talks about the cinema of ideas, or it's not a thesis, and that's his quote I'm quoting. It's not a thesis, not a book. It's a film at the aesthetic level, at the cinematic language, has to be and to have an effect, meaning you're touched by it. So that is something that he would not compromise. But he is a man of his time. He even told me at some point, I asked him about his relationship with the next generation, and he said, well, if I am a man of this moment. If I don't belong to this modern time, then I died one full day and I'm not existing. So for him, it's all about being surrounded by young people and and recreating himself as he goes. That's just an aspect of how he renews himself. Otherwise, he doesn't ever want to be locked in place. In fact, I think, as we established, that he was sometimes speaking too soon, and that's why being surrounded by young people and producing with them always made him a revolutionary. There is another scene in this Al-Asfour, the setup, like the room where they are in. There is graffiti on this room with a big head of a man that with big hair, and there are people around, and the poem that keeps being repeated, like the crowd, wal-hashd and all that. If you see this today, if you had watched our screening, you will see how contemporary this is. It's almost telling the 2011 story. So I don't know if that answers your question, but his idea is that you have to think and have ideas, because one of his quotes in Al-Masir, ideas have wings, no one can prevent them from flying. So he's concerned with ideas, but he's not concerned with ideology. Otherwise he would be that locked person in a prison of ideology. He's not concerned with that. And he also cares for the cinematic language and the aesthetic, cinematic, artistic tools, and so he's exemplary in this. And even if he tiptoed, as I say, towards the end, being more commercial, more accessible, his characters are more caricature, again, the timestamp on the things he discussed in his cinema early on is still there to attest for his real genius.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Back and forth. Okay, so a lot of the people here didn't see it. I guess only one or two people, but maybe you can recreate the scene. It was this Johnny character.
Yes.
So this was made in, say, he was saying 67, so this is supposedly set in 67.
Right.
And then he said the English left 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then he kept saying these phrases with, once, and he uses a few English words, throwing them in. And I was wondering, how representative was this Johnny character for people of the time? I mean, I know that people wanted to get rid of the British, but if you compare that, 67 to, we're almost 2017, that's what, 60 years roughly, 50 years. And now you have all these AUCians, and they code switch back and forth between English and Arabic. And how would a code switcher, how was a code switcher like that? He was very caricatural, and he was kind of a drunkard, and he wasn't a very respectable character. And he seemed to have been kind of imbued with these actually anti-English ideas, but he'd been, he'd been serving the military or something because he knew a little bit of English. I was just interested in this code switching, but it's very different than what people do today.
So there is this character of Mahmoud al-Medidi, Johnny, in the film. He's called Johnny because he used to deal with the camps, he was trading with the British, and that is ultimately kind of the traitor, right, at the time of the colonization, and if you're deep doing business with the British. Yet again, because my argument is that the cells in the Egyptian society are all hospitable in his film. Actually, you start out with thinking that this guy is kind of an outcast, he's a drunkard now, his time has passed, there's no colonialism anymore, he was the one who was doing business, and you dismiss him as such. But he, at the time of the announcement of the president and speaking and the defeat and all of that, we do see a double entendre there where the sheikh starts drinking, and he says this quote was like, we were defeated and we didn't even know it. Whereas Johnny sobers up, and he's very sober, and he's the one who, and it's a very cinematically, beautifully executed scene, where he's the one who's most cogent and most sober, and he sits there and listens. So kind of like in all of these very complex characters that are representative of ideologies or strands of thinking, they are not caricatured actually in the end. And the conversation, by the way, this character is the one who brings the sparrow as a gift for his daughter, and then that's the sparrow that is released at the end. So this very character is actually very instrumental in the sense, if you're just going to say America and the British, the colonialism, bad stuff there, and think that's it, and you have a cliche of Egyptian Nasserism and nationalism and independence, well, look what will happen if you do not address actual very deep state-society relations. Where's the economy going? Where's the ruling? Where's the freedom? And that sparrow has to eventually be released, and you head to defeat. So the film of the character of Johnny actually is very deep.
What's your favorite character and favorite film?
Favorite film?
From Youssef Chahine, your favorite character or your favorite film?
I like very much Alexandria. Why? Because it's the quest of it's in this film he really tells the story of going and studying in America, and for me this is the actualization of his crossing the sea. So, and he plays himself, and there is a character. No, this is in 1978 produced. And it's autobiographical, so his character is played. And Mohsen Mohiuddin is the one who's playing that character. So I like this film a lot. Cinematically, I love Bab al-Hadid. Visually, in black and white.
Was Bab al-Hadid one of the first films to discuss sort of the working class as heroes?
Yeah, the outcast, the disabled person who's frustrated and he's ignored. I mean, this again, in my analysis of self and other, how can you ignore part of yourself within the society, and then it ends in a crime and all of that. So it's kind of like we're very sympathetic to this very character who's an outcast. So who would pay attention in the movie at the time, mind you, the industry, you know?
And the shots sort of glamorized the railway workers and stuff. The shot with Hind Rostam and him.
Yes.
When he's telling him he wants to marry her,
yes.
He's going to buy her all the gold and stuff. That shot is very, very nice.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Well, we have to stop.
Go watch this film. I'm bringing his voice
obviously, after listening actually to Marwa, one is very nostalgic to Youssef Chahine. One wants actually to go and watch his films. I was asking myself when we were talking, how come you left Youssef Chahine behind and went on a different topic for a PhD? You are still very much passionate about him.
I do have an answer to that, and that is how he himself thinks. I think cinema and politics are very intertwined, and I said at the time, 2011, there will be no films produced during this time because we are actual actors on the street. There is a public space and public participation is happening. No films are to be made right now. And when I was picking a topic at the time, I had to pick a topic that would be of the moment. And what was the topic of the moment, 2011, February 11th, was the idea that where did these tanks come from? The tanks are not visible before. So then I started thinking civil-military relations and the trajectory, because I don't see them as a uniform thing. The military was out of politics by 67 actually, and under Sadat, and then they came back into politics by 2011 with the shift. And so my argument, even in my own kind of pure political science, comparative politics of the Middle East, is that the military was not uniformly for 60 years there. This image for me was a scene. Out of politics, into politics, where were they? I think I was thinking like Youssef Chahine. If that's the moment that I need to read about, as he goes and educates himself and says I have to go read these journals and educate myself about politics, I think exactly that's how I started my dissertation, with that scene from the I'm watching and where did they come from? So, and where are they going? So, and I think that's how I merge the political actor on the ground, and then you go back to think and reflect and do academic work, research and writing, and then there will be films coming. And I anticipate in my own theorizing of where you'll start seeing more filmmakers now, because again, as I argued earlier, if the political space is closing, then you're not an actor in real life, then you really go do your own thing in a film. So this alternation also of filmmakers doing their thing, or filmmakers on the ground doing actual political participation, is not that binary and it's not that dichotomous. So in a sense, he inspired me even in that.
Good answer. In political science and social science generally, we do lots of quantitative work. Karim knows something about that. But actually that discussion about whether Youssef Chahine was too much of a pioneer, was too much ahead, and he was penalized perhaps in the box office. But
was it sort of like jazz music for musicians, you know, playing jazz music that no one understands? Only, you know, sort of the cliche jazz music for musicians only? Sort of a mix of crazy music that only a musician who understands notes and melody can understand? Or was he trying to really say something to, not everyone, but to some people at least, you know?
It's this and that.
But the most important point, I think, is that if he were not raising these important issues ahead of his time, wouldn't have been interested in talking about him today.
Yeah. So don't be afraid to speak too soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even if you just put a time stamp on.
And on that, I think I want to, in your name, thank Marwa very much to come and reveal that great spirit, really, with so many issues that live with us up till now and probably in the future. Thank you very much.